Welcome back to our next part of our discussion on Brinkley's reading. I just want to take a second to talk about the thesis statement again, where you were asked to write a few questions about this, and most of us did a really good job. But a couple of words that I really want to point out there is the idea of a unique opportunity that never before, and maybe not until World War II, will the federal government be given this type of opportunity to radically change, to really push through a radical social revolutionary agenda. And they're going to push this through the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, where they're going to try to create more egalitarian, which in a sense means legally equal. And we are going to see some improvements, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a failure because of the follow through. It's going to descend, if you will, back into white control over blacks, specifically through the Jim Crow period itself. So some of the questions that came up, to how extent was Reconstruction successful? To make that more specific, we would talk about the economic successes, the social successes, the political successes, and we're going to get to those as well. But the second part of our test that we would normally take or have to prepare for is this idea of the Reconstruction plans themselves, that comparing and contrasting them. One thing to kind of note about the Republicans, of course, not created in the first election that they win is in 1860. They run a candidate in 1856, but really created in 1854, and it's one of the fastest rising political parties. It's an incredible movement. But the Republicans themselves are divided. You have a group of conservative Republicans, and you have a group of radical Republicans. And so the first question that comes across in our reading was the contrast those conservatives and those radical Republicans. Lincoln himself was a conservative Republican. He was not in this radical group that we're going to find out later. And the conservatives, they insisted, of course, that abolition be followed, but they really had very few other proposals. The second, and the video goes through this more extensively, that you had to watch as well, was the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans are going to be led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. And yes, this is the same Charles Sumner who was beaten in his office after his crime against Kansas speech, if you will. But the radicals themselves, what made them radical was this idea of offering equal and legal opportunities to African Americans. And also, what made them radical was their views on Southern whites, specifically the idea to disenfranchise former Confederate civil and military leaders. So, enfranchisement, or franchisement, I should say, means the right to vote. So, if you disenfranchise, then that means you take away their right to vote. And this is exactly what they wanted to do to a large number of these Southern whites. They also want to extend a legal protection, that the federal government and the state governments would be responsible for protecting African Americans' legal rights. They wanted to confiscate property of the white plantation owners and redistribute this to the freedmen. So this is why they were called the radicals, and they wore that term with a lot of pride, and they did consider themselves to be radicals. And as we saw in the earlier reading, that they viewed this because they believed that the only way to move forward was to do this, that the South was not going to do this on their own. It's often said, that rattlesnakes do not commit suicide. And they saw these folks as being that, and that they were going to have to essentially chop the snake's head off to ever be able to get equal rights and voting rights for the former slaves. So moving on to question 8, where we look at Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. And I have Johnson and Lincoln here beside each other. But of course, Lincoln's plan becomes known as that 10% plan because it says what it is, that Lincoln believes in a very quick, a very lenient Reconstruction period because the states had never left. He wants to do this under his power, as we've already established with this. And his plan was announced in December of 1863, and it essentially does what it says, that he's going to have general amnesty towards Southern whites, except for the high-ranking officials in government and military officials. And then once 10% of that state's population, male white voting population, agrees to take this loyalty oath, if you will, that they could then set up a state government and they could apply to him personally back for readmittance into the Union. To go along with this, the 13th Amendment is going to be passed before Lincoln's death. If you haven't seen the movie Lincoln, that was out a few years ago, directed by Steven Spielberg, this is kind of what it follows, is that ratification of the 13th Amendment, which says that it abolishes slavery, essentially. Now, there are some exceptions to that, of course. You can be incarcerated and be forced into labor. This is how we're going to get chain gangs and other labor in prisons as well, but that's a story for another time. Um, so one of the things that Lincoln also talked about is extending the right to vote to what he called the educated, property owning blacks who had served in the Union Army. If you met one of those, then he thought about allowing. He's not going to be around, of course, for the 15th Amendment, which is going to give full suffrage to African American men, but he's at least thinking in that sense. And so part of Lincoln's plan, not only the 10%, but also that they had to ratify the 13th Amendment. Well, question 9 asks about, what is the radical Republicans' response to this? And they're astonished. They're really completely taken off guard by how mild this is. And in fact, they refuse to seat the states that had qualified under Lincoln's plan. So Lincoln's plan is just that. It's a plan. It never really takes complete action because the Republicans refuse to even allow them back into the Congress. And you're going to see they do the same thing with Johnson. In response to Lincoln's plan, then, the Republicans passed their own, they proposed their own bill, and it's known as the Wade-Davis bill. This comes in July of 1864, and it authorizes the president to appoint a provisional governor for each one of these conquered states. So all of these 11 conquered states, they're going to have a provisional governor who's going to oversee them. And when a majority of the state's population, not the 10% of the white male population, pledged this loyalty oath, that they could then have a constitutional convention, that the states would then have to abolish slavery. They would have to disenfranchise the Confederates, taking away the right to vote, of the civil and military leaders. So this gets debated out through Congress. It passes the House, and then it passes the Senate. And then it's sent to the states. Once it's sent, it's sent to the president to be voted upon. Well, Lincoln gets this bill, and he performs what's known as a pocket veto. So there are a couple of ways that presidents can veto, if you remember from our government unit. One of them is this pocket veto. He refuses to comment on it. He allows it to lie on his desk, and it will simply die in 10 days. The other way is an express veto, if you will, where he has to then mark it up, say, and give suggestions of what to do about this. So Lincoln doesn't do that. He doesn't want to take that political risk, if you will. So he just simply allows the bill to die, and the Republicans don't have enough votes to override this said veto. So, of course, we know the story of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. And so we fast forward to Andrew Johnson. Many presidential historians would rank Andrew Johnson at the bottom or even the worst president that we've ever had. And it's a fascinating take upon Johnson. Brinkley even gets into the fact that he's really not very well suited for this type of job. He had been a Democrat up until 1864. He had never left the Union. He continues to work in Washington the whole time of the Civil War. And Brinkley goes on to describe him as intemperate, as tactless, as filled with resentment and insecurities, openly hostile to the freed slaves. And this is going to be the key. And we see this with Frederick Douglass's take upon him earlier. He's unwilling to support any plans that guarantees civil equality. Another thing about Johnson that you might find interesting is that at the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, where he famously gives his second inaugural address with malice towards none and peace towards all, is Johnson is absolutely cannot even stand up from being drunk. They have to hold him up underneath the arms for him to take his oath of office as the vice president. And then they literally walk him off the stage and put him to bed. He said that he had had a toothache and he had stayed up drinking whiskey to get rid of that toothache. And you can take that for whatever you want it to be. So once Johnson then comes into the presidency, the Republicans already know that they're probably going to have some issues with Johnson, just from his own personality and what they already know of him. And so then we get into question 11, which was Johnson's plans for Reconstruction. And Johnson has some similarities with Lincoln, and we'll be able to see these as we get through this. The first, he is going to offer general amnesty to Southerners, which Lincoln does as well. And they also had to take an oath of office. But high-ranking Confederates and Southern whites with land worth more than $20,000 or more would have to apply to the president individually for pardons. So there would be no blanket pardon. You couldn't just take an oath necessarily, but instead, any with incredible wealth in the former slaveocracy, if you will, the slave owning class, would have to then personally ask him for this. And it really shows in this idea that he saw himself as the spokesman, if you will, as the supporter of the poor Southern whites. And it wasn't that he was opposed to what slavery did to African Americans. He was opposed to what slavery did and how it cut out the white population from this. His plan actually resembles the Wade Davis bill in many forms. He also calls for the appointment of provisional governors, just like the Wade Davis bill had done before. And he would then invite qualified voters to elect delegates. They could form a constitutional convention, but he didn't give a specific number. So it's not like the 10% plan, but the idea is that it's a majority, although he never gives this. So it's an implied majority to win readmission, but he never quite says it. So under his plan, what did they have to do? They had to revoke secession. They had to abolish slavery and ratify the 13th Amendment. So Johnson was anti-slavery, but again, he was more anti-slavery because of what it did to the poor whites. They had to repudiate the Confederate and state war debt. So here's what this means. Is that it basically that the South had to agree that they would never be compensated for the value of their slaves because they could not claim this as war debt. And the other thing that it did is it essentially told the rest of Europe who had loaned money to the Confederacy at some point that we would not be, as the United States government, paying them back in any way, shape, or form. And once they had met those, then they could elect a state government. They could send representatives to Washington, D.C., and under his plan, they would be readmitted under the president's authority. So by December of 1865, all of the seceded states had formed these new governments under Johnson's plan. And they all were prepared to rejoin and enter the Union once Congress would recognize them. Well, at this point, the Congress wasn't like it is today where it meets year round, and they would take these long breaks. And so Johnson tries to push all of this through while Congress is on their fall break. And so when the radicals come back, and question 12 gets into what is their response to this, they vowed not to recognize Johnson's new plan and allow for these states to enter. And in fact, they closed and barred the doors. And so all of these states who had thought that they had been readmitted under the Union had actually not once the radical Republicans get there. So when Congress reconvened in December of 1865, they refused to seat these new delegates. And they then have a committee basically to put together the Congressional plan. In the 1866 elections, we're going to see an even further increase in the number of radical Republicans in Congress. And so what we're going to find is what we're going to call a veto proof. They're going to essentially get all of the House and all of the Senate under one party rule, which is going to start to dominate what the presidents are going to be able to do. In response, under Johnson's plans, these southern states began to pass a series of laws that become known as the Black Codes. And this is the precursor to what's going to become the Jim Crow laws. But essentially, these state legislatures are going to enact these laws that are designed to give whites substantial control over the former slaves themselves. They're going to authorize locals to apprehend unemployed blacks. They're going to fine them for vagrancy. They're going to hire them out to private employees, again, and take a part of this wage, if you will. And some even forbid blacks to own or lease land or to take any other jobs other than farmhands. And so this is that beginning of not protecting these civil rights in the end. Although Congress does, and this is part of that tug of war that we'll continually get through, Congress's response to what's happening in the South is the first thing is they're going to extend the Freedmen's Bureau. They're going to re-up it. If you remember, it is originally only created for a year. It was only to be enacted for a year. And they're actually going to then re-up this and give it more power to nullify these new acts in these southern states. And then in April 1866, the very first Civil Rights Act ever in the history of the United States is going to be passed by Congress. And this is where it's very important. And if you didn't get this down in your notes, that you do now. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it declared all blacks to be citizens of the United States, and it gave the federal government power to intervene in state affairs to protect these rights. That's radical, right? That's right. There had never been a civil rights for anybody, and this is then going to extend it. But Johnson vetoes this. At this point in time, the Congress does not have necessarily enough to override all of his vetoes. And Johnson, by far, is going to have more presidential vetoes. He's going to veto more bills under his continuation of Lincoln's term for 3.5 years than every president prior to him. And that tells you how contentious this relationship was with them. Well, once the Civil Rights Act was not completely enforced, the Congress knew that it had to take a step a little bit further. This is some of our radical Reconstruction. As you can, I want to get into a little bit of this as well. We can see Thaddeus Stevens. If any of you at Kaufman, if you remember where we had, oh shoot, what was his name? He was the health teacher. He looks a lot like him anyway, but there's Charles Sumner at the bottom as well. But some of this help for the Freedmen's Bureau that comes. We saw this, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, we talked about it. And now I want to talk a little bit about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, if you're going to go into law, is probably 2/3 of all court cases and civil rights cases are going to fall under the 14th Amendment in one aspect or the other. And it's one of these amendments that's much longer than what we give it credit for. And it has some specifics that aren't necessarily relevant to today, but it is relevant to our class. So the 14th Amendment, it's going to be proposed in April of 1866. And here's what it does. The first thing is that it offers the very first constitutional definition of what citizenship is. And it's defined then as everyone born on U.S. soil or U.S. territories or properties. Everyone, it would be then become what's called a naturalized citizen, and then automatically become and have the equal rights of all citizens. So in essence, it made all peoples born, including the former slaves, citizens. It also then meant that all immigrant children who had moved here as well, and then finally Native Americans would also be part of this citizenship rights too. The second thing that it did is that it established what we call equal protection or due process. And we can see this in the notes here, equal treatment under the law. It's the very first time in our government that the states and the federal governments all had to be on the same page with protecting individual rights. One of the things that we'd found out, some loopholes, if you will, through the Bill of Rights, is that in the Bill of Rights, it says what government cannot do. But it actually doesn't define what state governments could not do. So the Bill of Rights really only existed for the federal government. So that your freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of press and illegal search and seizure and all those that we talked about, it only established what the federal government couldn't do. It didn't establish what the state governments. So in essence, the 14th Amendment then makes the Bill of Rights enforced not only by the federal government, by the state governments as well. And that's a huge, huge turning point here. It now said that the states are responsible for equal treatment too. It also said that you could have no other requirements for citizenship. It imposed penalties on states who reduced that if they did not follow this, that they could lose the total number of representatives that they had. And it also prohibited members of Congress or any other officials who had aided the Confederacy from holding any state or federal office unless 2/3 of Congress then voted to pardon them. The only southern state to ratify this initially was Tennessee. It did not initially have the 3/4 states' approval. In 1866 congressional elections, like I said, the radicals would win more of these seats, and they would now have this veto proof. So over time, the 14th Amendment would be established. So just to kind of repeat a little bit here as far as the 14th Amendment. The first thing is it establishes citizenship. Oh, goodness. I'm going to have to pause. I'm getting somebody. this.